All right, so nice to see everyone again. So in this is supposed to be a pretty short session of 15 minutes, but maybe now 20 minutes. Uh, in this session, we will revisit the topic of Agile and try to go a little deeper from where we stopped today morning. So we did speak about Agile today morning, but we did not go into too many details. And in this session, let's try to refine what an epic is and go in more details of that. Also in this session, I would like to briefly touch upon process improvement in general. All right, so uh, on the topic of epic story and task, we'll focus on what is the definition of done, how do we refine issues, and how do you estimate time taken for your agile processes. So when everyone is adopting Agile, the concept of epic is important and it serves to manage your Agile project. We saw in the morning today that epics are high-level requirements. And in addition to epics, the concept of stories and tasks was also introduced. In terms of hierarchy, epics are top level, and then comes stories and under epics, and then come tasks under stories. So epics, stories, and tasks. I also mentioned today morning that epics can have multiple stories, and stories have to complete or they have to be marked as done. When all stories in an epic are marked complete, then that epic is automatically completed. Stories can have multiple tasks, and tasks basically are just steps so that you finish your story. Now, some important things to remember that is also mentioned on the slide is that you need to break down and refine your high-level epics into stories only when you need to and as you need to. Ideally, you would want to refine them when you're getting close to the time of the actual work being done. If you refine them too early on in the game, then you might have to change them later based on changing requirements. So basically, you should just plan enough so that you're ready to move forward, but don't plan so much that you end up reworking your plans all the time. So in terms of timeline, higher level objectives like epics get defined earlier in timeline, finer grained objectives like stories and tasks get defined closer to the implementation timeline. When we talked about epics, one concept we didn't talk much about was the definition of done. Defining the word done essentially tells everyone when that story is going to be completed. The done definition should be understood by all stakeholders, all customers, and it should be in their language. The user language out here is very important so that the customers understand what value they are getting from the story. And if it is too technical, they might not understand that. Defining defining done also helps one understand the finer nuances of the higher level epic objectives. Many times the epic might be too complicated, so defining done is good. Now coming to the lowest level, oh, one more thing is that if you define the definition, or if you define done well, then it can help align expectations of the customers as well as the development team. Now coming to tasks. So tasks are steps necessary to complete the story, and these tasks may not be of interest to your to your customer, as they may be too low level. It may be too technical, and usually they're needed by the development team. So yeah, out here, one way to think about the definition of done is a story which is done has met all the acceptance criteria for that story. Now, there are several definitions of acceptance criteria that have been popularized by different organizations. Some of them are listed out here. For example, one definition from Microsoft Press states that acceptance criteria are conditions that a software product must satisfy to be accepted by the end user. And then there's a definition by Google, which says pre-established standards or requirements that a project or product must meet. Now, acceptance criteria can be of two types. It could be functional, that is describing what functionality the product must provide, must exhibit, or it could be non-functional, example, something related to some characteristics of the software quality. And actually there's one more, which is based on performance requirements, which is very important in research environments, that my end product should perform 5 times better than XYZ. So basically the acceptance criteria can be of 3 types. Having the definition of done is quite important before you actually start working on your story. And this is quite interesting when you talk about it in the context of research projects. Many times when you're working on a research project, you don't really know exactly where your research efforts are going to go. You can't predict what's going to happen, but it's still good to have an idea of what it would look like if it were to complete. If you were to complete that story, what would the end result look like? To have a vague idea or a concrete idea is a good starting point than having nothing. In any agile research environment, you know the broad epic, but to get the full picture of all this, you may not have a full picture of all the stories. So it's okay to have some stories defined to help you get started and to prototype something, efficiently. And if you don't know how to do it, then you take your epic and then you start writing story one at a time until you have a better idea, a better picture, or a clearer picture emerges. The definition of done should be defined by the people who are doing the work, but it should be acceptable by the customer so that the done criteria can be renegotiated or terms could be worked out if that's important. So you don't need to specify too many details that are not relevant to the topic. For example, you don't have to specify that this is what my graphical screen will look like and these are the color of the buttons and so on. So unless it's truly relevant, you don't really need to get into the nitty-gritty or specific details of your done criteria. Refining our epic. So now let's look at the epic that we discussed earlier in the morning. It's listed on the slide out here under description. And basically that epic, if you read, it covers two things. It covers a need for separating, it's based on a heat equation, and it covers two things, right? One is the need for separating the utility functions, and the second is separating out the integration function. So today morning we had outlined two stories for each of this need that emerged from the epic. And one of the stories was for the utilities. It was something like, as a developer, I want to modularize and separate out my utilities so that I can use those utilities for other projects. So that was one of the stories. So now, after writing the two stories, we should start working on the definition of done and come up with a list of tasks that are needed to complete, to get to the done stage. So I think on the next slide out here, we see for story 1, the definition of done. And for story 2, we see a task list. So for story 1, my definition of done here out says all unit tests have to pass, integration system tests have to pass, code review should take place, performance should be 95% of what it was before, and so on and so forth. So out here, I have listed my interpretation of what would be considered done for this story. And you should work with your team to figure out what list of things should be, considered for making the story done. So you have to ensure that, again, you have to ensure that the stakeholder is happy with your definition of done out here. Story 2 out here gives a list of the tasks that will be needed to complete the story of separating out the integration function. And we've added 3 tasks. The first task was adding testing for the integration function to ensure that it works properly. The second is generalizing the interface. And the third is exposing the integration function so that other applications or interfaces could use it. So you can definitely add more tasks should you need to, and make it, personalize it a little more, if depending on how many people you have in your team, how it works out to break the task between different people, and so on and so forth. When you are breaking down epics into stories and tasks, there is no right or wrong granularity. You should do what's useful for your team, and you'll kind of figure over time, even if you might have a few hiccups in the start. You may have stories in the start that are very simple, and you may not want to create any tasks for them because the stories themselves are simple, but rather you would want to just make like a high level checklist that this is what needs to be done. So you could keep things simple, and sometimes you may have to design tasks. Like I have 3 team members, and it's better to split the work between 3. So my task will be based on what work is done by each person rather than based on some other facet of the code. So that is also acceptable. It totally depends on what's working for you and your team. Let's talk about agile estimation. Your ability to estimate how long it will take to complete your epics and stories is going to depend on the maturity of the project, the experience uh, of the people who are actually doing the estimating. A significant point about agile estimating is that generally stories aren't estimated in hours. They're estimated by using something called as story points, and story points are a relative. They're a relative estimate. What is a story point? A story point is a number that tells your team about the difficulty level of the story. Uh, how do you decide what a point is? So let's say you have a bunch of user stories. So you sit with your team and you discuss details, get answers to questions, discuss how to implement each of the stories. Essentially, you try to get enough details for one of the stories so that you can say that this is worth 1 story point. And once you figure out that this amount of work is worth 1 story point, then maybe the next story you can say this is worth 4 story points, this is worth 3 story points. So it's all relative, and you do require some amount of playing around with it. It's not fixed in a number of hours on a day, but the good news is that you get better at it as you learn to define it and implement it, and see how accurate you are. There are many estimating techniques you can use. Sometimes people can get very bad at estimating because people can sometimes consider consistently determine that a task is one task is, they're not sure if this task is bigger than that when it comes to implementation, or is it the same size. Sometimes it's a bit challenging. But something like, for example, Scrum uses estimation all the time, and it allows its team to pretty really accurately predict when any of these upcoming stories might be completed. Try to keep things simple when it comes to estimating stuff. It's a lot easier when you try to estimate time taken to complete an epic when you break it down into smaller tasks. It's easy to miss stuff when you don't break down stuff, when you don't break down into smaller chunks, and it's quite possible to underestimate the cost of adding tests and running more verification suites and so on. So use iteration and incrementation only for projects you want to succeed. That's a good quote to remember. Let's talk a bit about process improvement. When we're talking about process improvement, we are essentially saying add more processes to improve something, to improve XYZ. Let's add more processes to improve that. Realistically, there is always a cost for adding any process. It's a startup cost, right? There's going to be overhead associated with getting started. And one hopes there's going to be a big payoff after the initial high cost. And one hopes that the ongoing cost will be less and will benefit the team over time. So we are hoping that you don't get overwhelmed by the bit of overhead that actually happens in the start, and that you begin to experience the cost savings as you go ahead. So this graph out here basically just tries to show that graphically that new process takes time, but overall it may be much better, it'll cost you lesser than compared to the old process. So let's talk a little bit about process improvement. One way to implement improvements in your project is through this process called PSIP. PSIP stands for Productivity and Sustainability Improvement Planning. It's an extremely lightweight process for you to adopt better practices in your project in like small incremental ways. There are other process improvement techniques that exist, but which might require an overhaul of your project. PSIP is something that can slide in easily, and the changes will be so small that they will probably integrate well with your team without too much disruption. You can get more information about PSIP there's a link out there, bssw.io/PSIP. So if you go out here on this link, you can get a good starting link that will point you to other resources about PSIP. On this slide, we have two examples of teams that have used PSIP successfully. One is the MPitch team, which is the message passing interface MPI team, and they use PSIP for their onboarding of new team members. And the other is the PSIP effort that was conducted by the Agile team for the continuous integration testing. So I can go more into the details of PSIP and how it works. Essentially, it starts with like if you want to improve the onboarding process in your team, you create something called as a progress tracking card, PTC, and you list down different steps that you want to achieve going towards your higher level goals. So out here, I don't know if you can see clearly, we have progress tracking cards for both the MPitch onboarding as well as the Agile CI testing effort. Again, I encourage you to go to bssw.io/psip URL to get more information about it. And should any of you have interest specifically on this process improvement topic or PSIP, Anshu, David, me, everybody, both the Davids, we are all kind of familiar with it and can help put you in touch with the right team should you be interested. Yeah. With this, I end my talk. If you have any questions, I would be very, very happy to take them.